Hello, in this video, I'll be giving a plot account of the play She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith. This story is a very intriguing, very interesting story filled with laughter, comedy, and above all, love. It starts and it centers on the misunderstandings encountered by young Marlowe, who is in search of a wife, on his way to Mr. Hardcastle alongside his friend Hastings. On their way to Mr. Hardcastle to meet up with the proposed wife by his father and Mr. Hardcastle in the person of Kate, they meet the unserious, ever playful Tony Lumpkin on the way, who misdirects them to the house of Mr. Hardcastle in the guise of that they are going there in a guest house. Apparently, they have this idea that they're going to the house of the guest or an inn, with Mr. Hardcastle and every other persons they find there as innkeepers. Tony directs them as a result of the axe he has to grind with the father, who is supposed the a stepfather to him. Marlowe takes his future father, young Marlowe takes his future father-in-law for an innkeeper and behaves rudely contrary to the stories Mr. Hardcastle has gotten from his friend, Mr. Marlowe. Alongside with his friend Hastings, they behave rudely as opposed to what they expect of the in-laws. They are expecting to get married to their daughter. Kate, on the other hand, has another view, another perspective towards this supposed husband of his. Apparently, she stoops to conquer and to understand the person she's getting married to. She stoops in and disguises herself as a maid who goes about doing her dealings, as with the fact that young Marlowe has this notion that he is in a guest house. So she disguises herself as a maid and treats young Marlowe as he is supposed to. Contrary to how he behaves to the father of Kate, Mr. Hardcastle and Mrs. Hardcastle, Marlowe behaves shy and behaves, he behaves well and moderate to Kate. All these are happening with Kate having a notion of young Marlowe as opposed to the notion the father and the mother have over young Marlowe. On the other hand, Hastings, the friend of young Marlowe, falls in love with Neville, the cousin of Mrs. Hardcastle. Apparently, Mrs. Hardcastle wants Neville to get married to Tony Lumpkin, her legitimate son, who is a stepson to Mr. Hardcastle. But Neville and Tony Lumpkin hate each other's guts. Apparently, there is no love that binds between them. So the wish of Mrs. Hardcastle will never come to pass. On the other hand, Mr. Marlowe comes and joins in the house of Mr. Hardcastle and finds out that Mr. Hardcastle and Mrs. Hardcastle have a different notion he has painted of his son, young Marlowe. They believe that young Marlowe doesn't really love their daughter, Kate, and therefore the marriage should not proceed. But because of the convincing argument Kate presents to both parents, Mr. Hardcastle and Sir Marlowe, they both decide to give a close watch and eye on young Marlowe. And they found out that actually, apparently, young Marlowe loves Kate, but in the guise of a maid. On the other hand also, Neville and Hastings, the friend of young Marlowe, decide to elope. They decide to run away since their love cannot be actualized here in the house of Hardcastle. But their plans were all cut off. Mrs. Hardcastle finds out and decides to send Neville off to London. She instructs her son, Tony Lumpkin, to drive Neville off to London. But Tony Lumpkin ran about the house with the car, and then they got the idea that they were lost in the woods. Mrs. Hardcastle, fed up and tired of the whole thing, she gave up the idea of sending Neville off to London and decides to allow Hastings and Neville to get married. Also, the family of Mr. Marlowe and Mr. Hastings all decided that since they found out and they've got proof that young Marlo really loves Kate, they decide to allow the wedding and the marriage, the union, to go all through. So it actually ended in happy mode. This story is a very intriguing one. Alright, so the next video will be treating the setting, language and style used in She Stoops to Conquer.